Alright, so thank you guys for clicking over to part 2. And again, as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Berto and Alfredo Angulo. Now, in a weird sort of way, both are being trained by Virgil Hunter right now, but they're also linked in a different way to a certain extent. They don't fight in the same divisions. Berto's obviously a welterweight, and Angulo will be moving up to middleweight on Saturday as part of the Floyd Mayweather-Marcos Maidana rematch undercard. But they're linked together in the sense that they both are effectively having to come back from something. And Berto, over the weekend, beat Steve Upshur. That, effectively began his comeback. He looked okay at moments. At times, he looked like he was finding it hard to land at times. He seemed a bit ragged on the inside from time to time, but that's to be expected, working, again, with coming off the 2 losses to Robert Guerrero and the Jesus Soto Karass loss. They were both punishing losses too, particularly the Soto Karass one where he injured his shoulder. He was coming off the surgery from his shoulder injury that stemmed from that fight. And again, it was just a taxing, grueling fight to begin with. So it's to be expected that it was, going to be a bit of a work in progress once he started to once he was, coming back. And with Angulo, he's coming back from the 2 losses to Saul Alvarez and to Erislandy Lara. Actually, those happened in reverse order. And now is moving up to middleweight. But what they have in common, aside from just the sort of adversity that comes with anyone in terms of any career that you're really going to have, what they also have in common is the fact that they're both in very tough spots. Both have decent names, in their division. They're not always going to be the star in every single fight that they're in, but they are big enough that stars might be attracted to them, and fighters certainly looking for the proverbial stepping stone certainly could look their way in hopes of, maybe finding a fight that they think is winnable, but, they could still get some quality from the win itself. It would look good on paper, in other words. But at the same time, they're both good enough fighters that, if you count the entire division, the entire welterweight division for Berto and middleweight division for Angulo, it's pretty reasonable to suspect, because again, you'd have to suspect it in the case of Angulo as he is moving up, that they're still better than the majority of the division. Maybe not the top or the top 10, but of the majority of the division, they still are capable of winning most of those fights. So reasonably, they're going to look for those sort of fights. I mean, Angulo has said as much. He wants to take over the middleweight division. Berto, certainly a guy that was brought up in a way that would lead you to believe his handlers had, bright hopes for him. Certainly has those same hopes for himself and is looking to, cash in on those plans at some point in the future. And neither is a young guy, so they both, they know that they're working against it in terms of the clock, so they're definitely going to go after those fights. The problem is, again, with Angulo, you need to put him in these fights that are winnable, but that he'll actually gain something from. So, he stays relevant, he stays in the public eye, but it's also a challenge. So he knows what he can do with the weight. And with Berto, he needs to know what he can do post-surgery. But in a weird way, you always see fighters come back, maybe from a first loss or a layoff, or they just haven't reached their potential just yet, and people will say things like, oh, this is a must-win fight. He has to be able to prove it. A good example of that recently would be Kell Brook taking on Sean Porter in a different way, but it's still a good example of it, in that he had, mounds of potential, it seemed, and many people believe that, but even people that believed that started to get tired of this waiting game, hoping that he was going to inevitably cash in on that potential. Through no fault of his own, a lot of fights were just postponed, opponents pulled out, and just bad timing, bad luck can ultimately lead to those sort of things taking place. But nonetheless, the general public is not that kind all the time. They don't look at it that way. They just look at it as, we want to see what he has. We still have yet to see it after 30-plus fights. We're now tired of it. It's the way it happens. And that fight with Porter, he needed to win it. He needed to win that fight. It would have taken an incredible effort from Brook and from Matchroom Boxing to rebuild him after that point, especially to get him back to world level. It would have really taken a lot if he had lost to Porter. He needed that win. And, fortunately for himself, he did get the win, so all is well, I suppose. Aside from the fact that he got stabbed in the legs, which was just a weird thing to have to say, that someone got stabbed in the legs. But in any event, that is what happened, and aside from that, he obviously has had a successful 2014. But he did need to win that fight. And again, for different reasons, Berto and Angulo are in that sort of mode. They do need to win these fights. And obviously, Berto needed to beat Upshur. So, phase 1 completed. And Angulo will need to win his fight on Saturday in order to maintain any semblance of relevancy towards the top of the sport. The thing with both of them, however, is that at the very least for hardcore fans, but for fans in general, they are sort of in positions where they need to win maybe their next 2 or 3 fights. 2 maybe for Berto, 3, or 4 maybe for Angulo. Because Angulo was always a limited guy. Everyone knew that, but he was always in good fights. And you thought, well, if he's in a bit of a barn burner, he'll probably come through. And if he doesn't, it's at least a good fight. He loses the fight to James Kirkland. All of a sudden, his stock, it didn't take such a drastic hit, but you did know how limited he was. That even if it's a firefight, a fight that you would think he would want most, there could be a situation too. And if you put, if you're a brawler, and that's who you are, and even some of the brawls you're going to lose, it's going to be very difficult for people to look at you as a legitimate threat if you can't get wins wherever you can get them. And now moving up, where his punch might have just a little bit less of an effect, and where he might have a little bit less punch resistance, he needs to win fights. He needs to win a few of them, to make sure that at the very least, if he goes up against, at middleweight, someone like maybe a Matthew Macklin or something like that, or an Andy Lee, that if he comes up short in that fight, as long as he puts in, if he puts forth a good accounting of himself, that at the very least it might buy him another fight down the line. But if he were to take that fight next, after this fight on Saturday, and lose, I don't know how much longer people would look at Angulo as the sort of opponent that, let's put it this way, if a middleweight's coming up, I don't know how long that middleweight has to be able to fight Angulo and make it mean anything. Even if Angulo wins, then you look even worse as a prospect coming up. But if you beat him, well, everyone beat him. He was never what we thought he was going to be. He needs to win. And the same can certainly be said for Berto. Berto, slightly different position. He's had a title before in the past. He's been in some very big fights. He's been in some very, some good wars. He was in a war with Ortiz. He was in a war with Guerrero, and he definitely fought very bravely, very courageously against Soto Karass. But the one common denominator in those fights as well is that he lost all 3 of them. There was, there's really no 2 ways about it. He was hurt in 3 of those fights. He was stopped in 1 of those fights. He needs to win as well. There's no real debate about it. Any loss from now till perhaps the end of 2015 could be quite devastating for both of these fighters. It's very interesting, too, because they both have very distinct styles. Berto, obviously, is more a boxer-puncher. He does like to come forward, probably more than he should for his own good, but you would probably label him more a boxer-puncher than anything else, or maybe a puncher-boxer. But there is still boxing to his game. Angulo, on the other hand, while he's working with Hunter, is trying to gain some defense, trying to utilize the jab a bit more, and has, to his credit. At the end of the day, he is still a brawler. That's what you look at. If I ask you to use one word to describe Angulo, that's probably, insofar as boxing is concerned, that is what you would call him. You would call him a brawler. And yet, here they are, still stuck in the same position as the other, effectively, in need of wins, and a few of them, before they really take that step up. And then the good news for them, obviously the tough news at the very least, if you don't want to call it bad news, is that they're up against it a little bit. They do need to win. Any mistake could potentially cost them, a very lucrative career. At the same time, there is good news. The good news is the sort of opponents they probably need to face moving forward again for maybe the next year or so, the sort of opponents they need to face to build up that confidence, to build confidence in fans about these fighters, are the sort of fighters that have a semblance of credibility. You don't want to fight in tomato cans every single outing. That would kill their buzz just as easily as a loss would, to a certain extent. but you do need to give them fights that are winnable for them. They don't need a 50-50 fight just yet. Of course, Berto seems more likely to get that treatment. Angulo seems more likely to get thrown in there with a guy who needs a win against a guy who has a name, and that's, unfortunate for Angulo. But if handled correctly, both, I think, have enough to at least put themselves in one more big fight. But they do need to be handled correctly, which leads me to, unofficially here, the question of the week. If you were handling Berto and or Angulo, who do you put them in there with? What do you think would best build them back up to that one big fight? So I'm not talking about to put Berto in there with Mayweather or whatever because you think it might be interesting. I'm saying in order to get him to any potential fight the size of a Mayweather fight or even close to it, what would you do? How do you build him up? Who do you think he should, go through? How would you navigate his career and the career of Angulo? I'd love to hear your take on it. Because to me, I like that sort of boxing game, if you will. If you're a nerd like me, I'm sure you've played that game where you kind of sort of map it out in your head, and it might not peel off the way you expect, but at the very least, it's a fun little thing to do. So, love to hear your ideas, your suggestions. Who do you think they should face coming up? Who do you think they should take on? What do you think the outcome would be? And what do you think the end result of this little journey might be? Love to hear it, of course. Leave it in the comments, and you can hit me up on Twitter and give me a few of your thoughts at 12Rounder Boxing. And, just briefly here, I'll give you a bit of a rundown for the upcoming schedule. Of course, we have the big card, MGM Grand, Las Vegas, Nevada. We got Floyd Mayweather, the welterweight champion of the world, and the junior middleweight champion of the world, I might add, taking on Marcos Maidana in welterweight action. The Alphabet Boys, of course, have allowed Mayweather to defend both his 147-pound title as well as his 154-pound title at the same time, which, as you know, or maybe not, but as you should know, makes no goddamn sense because Maidana has never fought at 154 pounds. But why would the Alphabet Boys allow a little thing like common sense to get in the way of them making extra money? That's silly for me to even bring that up. In any event, it is a welterweight fight, and that's what it should remain, and that's the title that I would assume is legitimately on the line. That's, of course, the big fight. Then, of course, you have on the undercard, you have action featuring Leo Santa Cruz. You have, again, the aforementioned Angulo debut at middleweight. And you're going to have a lightweight title bout between titleist Miguel Vasquez taking on Mickey Bay. Should be an interesting fight. You can check the pick'em for that fight, the prediction I have for that fight, in the description below, as well as my prediction for Mayweather-Maidana in the description below. And again, check out the full schedule, 12rounder.com. Tell me what you think of those fights. Tell me what you think of the Angulo and the Berto situation again in the comments. Like, subscribe, share, all that great stuff. Hit me up on Twitter at 12rounder Boxing. And until next time, enjoy the fights.